Hello, darlings. We are visiting the Underworld today. It's such a delightful place to be. Not really. No, that was not true. I just lied just then. Don't listen to that. When we're talking about the Underworld, we are talking about the abode of the dead, the infernal regions, or sometimes it's just called Hades. It is not called hell. Do not confuse hell with the underworld. Hell is a Christian concept, and it does not equate with the ancient Greek perception of the underworld as a whole. So, anytime we're talking about the underworld, any of these other three names could be interchanged for it, just not hell. Okay, let us discuss the underworld. So, originally, the Greeks believed that the underworld was across the ocean. But when travel to distant places kind of put that theory to rest, the underworld changed to under the world, meaning in the center of the earth. And for our purposes, we are going to do a little tour through the underworld and go to some of the locations that are in the underworld and meet some of the Greek gods that live there. When we think of the Greek gods, we tend to think that all the Greek gods lived on Mount Olympus, but that's not the case. There's only 12 of them that live on Olympus. So many, many, many more of them live in the underworld or on Earth or, in the oceans. So let's start our journey here. So if we're going to travel through the underworld, the first thing we have to do is discover the cavern or the underground river and follow this winding path down, 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 down into the earth. Then the first thing we're going to come across is a river. And this is the river Acheron. Now, Acheron was the son of Gaia, and he was a water bearer to the Titans during the Titan and Olympian War. Unfortunately, because he fell on the wrong side of that conflict, Zeus threw him into the underworld and transformed it into its first river. And the river Acheron is sometimes referred to the river of woe or sadness or affliction. Now, the river Acheron flows into the river Styx, and this is where Charon kind of plied his trade. Charon has the monopoly, lucky him, on being the ferryman for the underworld. And you've got to pay the ferryman if you want to cross the river into the underworld. So because this was such a huge thing, Greek burial rites were enormous. This was a serious, serious thing. They were insistent on proper burial rites. And if the rites were not carefully followed, the shade of your loved one was doomed to forever wander the banks of the river Acheron and never cross over into the underworld. And you want that, especially if they were a good person. And, if they were your enemy, you wanted that too, because that could mean that they would go to a not so nice place in the underworld. But part of the Greek burial rites was to put this coin, it's called an obelisk, and it was placed in the dead person's mouth. And this is what Charon would take for payment in order to cross the river. If you didn't have the money to cross, you got no passage across. In fact, the only person to ever cross the river without payment was Orpheus. And, he just did his magical musical thing and convinced Charon that it was important that he get across. So to the Greeks, the soul was a pale reflection of its former personality. In other words, it was a shade of itself. In the underworld, there are only a few privileged persons who lived the same in the underworld as they did on Earth. Minos, if you remember him, he of the labyrinth, was one of these. And he served as a judge, which was one of the things that had to happen before the soul could continue on its journey through the underworld. So we're going to look at three main sections of the underworld. There's a lot of smaller areas, but the three big ones are Erebus, Tartarus, and the Elysium Fields. Everyone must pass through Erebus to be judged. You can think of it as a type of limbo until a judgment was made about you. But the Erebus is the entranceway or the vestibule. This is the place of judgment. And there is a tribunal that sat awaiting the various shades. And when you were judged, this tribunal would send you either to Tartarus or to the Elysium Fields, depending if they found a soul to be good or bad. In either case, you would begin your journey by crossing yet another river. Before we get to that river crossing, however, let's look at these three judges. Aeacus, who judged the Europeans. We had Rhadamanthus, who judged the Asiatics, and then Minos, whom we talked about before, and he was the one in charge of the difficult cases. So once you were judged, you would cross Cocytus, the river Cocytus. In some versions, Cocytus was the location where the punishments of murderers were undertaken, but in either case, this is the river of lamentation or wailing. Now, once you got across Cocytus, you would begin your descent into the underworld a little bit deeper. And there's some characters that you could meet. The Fates were one of these sets of characters that you might meet. The Fates were the ones who spun, measured, and cut the thread of life. And basically, they were the ones responsible for getting the soul to this point of the journey. Because if the thread of life had not been cut, then the individual would not have died. Some other spirits you might encounter were the Furies. Now, we talked about the Furies in the Odyssey when we were talking about Orestes. These are spirits of vengeance, and again, they pursued those transgressors who broke the three unbreakable rules, like killing your mother and your king, who for Orestes also happened to be his stepfather. Now, another spirit you would come across is Nemesis. Now, Nemesis doesn't get a lot of stage time, but she is a really cool character in Greek mythology. She was a sister to the Fates, and she was the spirit of just punishment and the goddess of retribution and the divine arbiter of justice, which means that she was not only concerned with punishment, but she also cared about making certain that people got their just rewards. If somebody did something good, you deserved a reward. And if you've ever been to a courthouse, you will probably have seen her blindfolded, holding both her scales and her swords to represent both aspects of her personality. Hecate is queen of the dead. She's also the goddess of witchcraft and wizardry. Thank you, Harry Potter. And when she's on Earth, she was said to haunt the tombs of the dead and sometimes scenes of crime. She is connected with Artemis, who is the goddess of the moon, but Hecate is the goddess of the dark side of the moon. Another fun fact for you theater buffs out there, the whole scene in Macbeth, the double toil and trouble scene with the other witches, Hecate makes an appearance in that. Shakespeare, you are awesome. Okay, let's move on. Let's talk about the River Styx. Now, the River Styx was the main river in the underworld. And Styx was also the daughter of a Titan, and like Acheron, Styx helped in the Titan-Olympian War. But she helped on the side of the Olympians. So she became the river of the gods. The cool thing about the River Styx is if a god swore an oath by her, it was irrevocable. It could not be broken. It was literally impossible for a god to break an oath that was made by the river Styx. So they were very, very careful about when and how they made those oaths. Now, as we keep going down and we're edging closer to Tartarus, which is going to be our first stop, you would be greeted by the smiling face of Cerberus. You probably already know that he was the watchdog at the gates of Tartarus. He's got 3 heads and venom dripping from all of his mouths, and he had a serpent or dragon tail. And although he would let souls in, he would not let them out. Fun fact about Cerberus, he could occasionally be bribed with a honey cake. If you remember from way back in our first quarter together, we talked about how Psyche bribed Cerberus with the honey cake. Or he could also be placated with some sweet music. Again, thank you to Orpheus for that.